I kind of want to talk about this more in like a general context, about about like the difference between male and female privilege. And I'm gonna use the Crowder video, male privilege is a myth, as like a jump off. So I'm kind of going, because I think I work a little bit better going through that, bouncing off of something else. That's a lot of what my content is. So going through that, we talked about like whether or not male privilege does or doesn't exist. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about um, these things, we talked about them in like a pure, like an absolute, where male privilege exists, but there's always a dismissal of the concept or idea that female privilege exists as well. Male privilege certainly exists. There's a privilege and a disprivilege to having any identity anywhere, generally speaking. The disparity between those privileges, I think, is a better conversation to have. And some of those disparity and privileges can come from something more biological. It can come from something more societally. But I think that we sometimes get a little fuzzy on which is which. But generally speaking, like, yeah, I would say that the disparity between men and women in the United States is much lower than we want to believe, even if we do need to slowly fix it. There are instances of male privilege and there are instances of female privilege. The biggest instance I think of male privilege is just having just generally power. It's easier for men to have power. Obviously, if I had to choose to be a man or a woman, I would choose the privilege that comes with being a man over the privilege that comes with being a woman. I don't know if there's more privileges to being a woman, but I think that if you contextualize everything, that at least me personally, and maybe this is anecdotal, I would rather be a man. I'd rather have a little more control. Now, obviously, there are disprivileges to being a man, or rather privileges to being a woman. Obviously, having custody of your child is one of those things. The expectation of going to war. There's the draft aspect. Generally society saying that you have to be tougher. Usually the responsibility of providing for a family comes with a higher suicide rate, a higher homelessness rate. A woman privilege would be the access to welfare programs and whatnot. So there are privileges. Now, a lot of times, every single time you say that, we bring it right back to, well, it's a patriarchal society, so it's all men's fault. The problem is that our society wasn't just developed by men. It was developed by men and women based off of our biological predispositions many, 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 many thousands or millions even, I suppose, of years ago, right? And as technology catches up and things are able to shift, and which technology is a great equalizer, we do see people wanting to be more equal, right? So guns and cars exist. So now women can be, more accessible when it comes to fighting. And they can drive places. There are a lot of technologies that allow women to exist in the workplaces, and more women want to do that. But let's just keep in mind that most women, at least 50 or 60 years ago, simply did not. And it is a very new thing that women want to exist more in workspaces, right? It's one of the reasons why women struggle to gain power. It's because many women may not want it. Now, I wouldn't say most nowadays, but you understand what I'm trying to say. It's not just a male thing. Our patriarchal society isn't just for men, it's for men and women, all right? The reason that we have diamonds is because women thought diamonds were cute and they wanted them, so men beat the shit out of each other for them, and now we have a slave trade. I'm not saying women's fault for everything. I'm saying that men and women both have an issue and both take part in the development of a patriarchal society, and nobody wants to admit that. So yeah, my reflections on that video. I think that that's something that Crowder would probably be fine with. It's a very interesting video of Crowder. I tended to agree with him more than anything else. Like I said, there's definitely female privilege. Yeah. When it comes to rape, he made some interesting points. I think that was something that's very important to bring up, because he talked about oftentimes it's the general understanding that women are raped and assaulted more than men, but apparently if you contextualize prison rape, men actually may experience it more, or at the very least equal, which is very much against the status quo. Now, I think that brings up an interesting concept of location having to do with, your level of safeness in this particular space, right? But that clearly, if to me, shows that generally in society, the biggest issue, like there's a bit more of an issue with the power dynamic when it comes to sexual assault and rape, when it comes to women versus men. Prison seems to be more of an outlier, and I would say that that comes from the fact that prisons need to be reformed very, very clearly. I would still say in the general, because I don't live in prison, right? So if you're a normal person walking out in public, if you're existing in everyday life as a person, you're more likely to be raped if you're a woman. Okay, if you're in jail, that's a completely skewed. That's obviously very different, but you can't really generalize that because we're talking about a societal issue. Prison isn't a societal issue, or rather, prison isn't a reflection of our society. Prison is an issue in our society, but it's not a reflection. So when it comes down to it, women are raped more in society because prison isn't a reflection of our society. Yeah. Let's see. What other points do I have? He often referenced legal full rights to men and women. I think that's a fair argument. I think that like you could definitely sectionalize this off as like issues in society, like or the issues in societal standards rather than like actual legal standards. He went into a whole kind of thing about how apparently back in the day women didn't want to be able to vote, and the reason is because they didn't want the negatives of having to vote, like the having to sign up for a draft and whatnot. I would say nowadays most women would probably want to vote. I don't think apparently it was only 4% actually did want to vote back then, or that was what was measured. We don't know if that's necessarily purely accurate, only because if it was done back then, I could imagine a level of bias towards people who didn't want women to be able to get power. But again, we would also say that clearly women won when it came to the voting thing because they didn't have to have the same responsibilities as men because they don't have to sign up for a draft as well as I'm assuming other things. So yeah, that's a fair argument. But again, I think women would want to vote now, obviously. But yeah, I would say that is a female privilege that women aren't held to the same standard as men just to get the right to vote. He brought up another argument about how like it was men who allowed women to vote, which is true. Men allowed women to vote. You can make the arguments like, well, it should have always been that way, maybe. But again, as we move through society, women were fine with not making those types of decisions. That was something that they felt was up to the man. I wouldn't say it was purely men who decided that. Women did as well, because again, women didn't want to take part in the power dynamic issue historically, which is shifting again due to technology. Let's see. Yeah, you could say it's another privilege for women that they're in jail less. Although when men are all, see, that's the thing is a lot of times this is actually a good case where we talk about men being in jail more means that it's a female privilege to not be in jail, or rather a male disprivilege to be in jail. But what I would actually say is that this is one of those situations where the reason that men are in jail more is because of a biological predisposition to aggression, and that's why men are in jail. And sometimes we need to differentiate the reasons why people have particular privileges, because in this case, it's not really a male privilege or rather it's not a male disprivilege that they're in jail more per se, from the context that they're more aggressive. However, I would say since society places the burden of providing for their family more, then that would be an example of male disprivilege. So it's very interesting when you contextualize all these different things. What I would say moving on is that this is a reason why, because it's so complicated, it's a reason why it doesn't necessarily matter. Who cares if men or women have privileges? Why does it matter these particular privileges? Rather than focusing on what privileges we have based on our identity, we should focus more on the issues that privilege or disprivilege has in society and figure out a way to actually fix society. Who cares about male, female privilege? Who cares about black or white privilege? How about we care about solutions to the issues that arrive from these particular things? Because when we get into these very complicated spaces and we just sit here and we're basically discussing theory, and then how do you implement some kind of how do you implement some kind of a solution to society when you've determined that men are just inherently evil? There's a lot of instances of people conflating everything to power. We would ask like, what's a privilege? And then all of a sudden, if we even brought up the fact that women may have privileges for being women, it was like, well, no, privilege has to have some level of power dynamic. It's very annoying. It's the same thing with racism. People make that argument. It's very ignorant. It's very annoying. And it just waters everything down to an ability to basically walk off and say, well, if you don't have power, you're always the victim, and everybody with power is a bad person. It's just a way to demonize individual people. I think one of the great questions we talked about her, he said, define a woman, is very interesting. And I don't know if I can necessarily define a woman. I think that like defining a woman, generally speaking, will be based on their wantingness or their, let's say, subscription to wanting to be what a traditional woman is, I suppose, which is more feminine, more dainty and whatnot. But if you want to include trans women, it does shift a little bit. I suppose what it means to be a woman is basically the same now with trans being included. I think that you get into a bit of a gray area with two things. One of those is people who are more gender fluid, which wouldn't even be women. But then there's people who aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily look like women, trans women who may not be passable, or trans men that may not be passable too, but we're sticking to women in this case. And so it's a little bit differently. So I think that there is a concept of, I honestly would say gender dysphoria is very validating for trans people. But it is an interesting topic that I've never really thought about. What makes a woman? It's very, very interesting. He did go on to have conversations about women in the military and how we had to lower standards for women for them to be into the military. That was a factor that was dismissed rather heavily, is how that's just inclusion and it's not pandering. I think it's an interesting conversation to have. I would say that it's very interesting because one could argue, well, obviously men would be better in the military. If they have to have higher standards set to them, for sure. And obviously you could say, well, they only lowered those standards so women could get in, but they lowered those standards to women based on a scale of relativity, I would say, right? So those women relative to being women are superior or able to handle that particular task, because relative to men, they're going to be weaker. So those skills should be weaker. Now, it gets into an interesting conversation. You could say, well, then maybe women shouldn't be able to serve in the army. I don't know how much, I don't know where they necessarily put women when it comes to the military. For all I know, there's some kind of auto regulation where the military understands that women may be inferior despite the fact, or less, strong. In many of these instances, so they decide to use men for the more, I don't know if you want to call them important tasks. I don't really know. I would say it's up to the military to deal with that. But it is a very interesting point. It really is a very interesting point. I think that also extends to being a police officer as well as other things. I mean, at the end of the day, a man is going to be more, physically capable when it comes to an extreme scenario. Though we do have guns, which are an equalizer to an extent, but on the off chance that there is some kind of a physical fist fight altercation, it can be rather catastrophic to not have another man with you. Who knows? Because then you could also turn around and say, well, how valuable is it to have a woman who has more empathy? Women talked about the objectification of women, but then also defended, or a woman just brought up the objectification of women, but then also kind of brought up the idea that women should, be able to kind of objectify themselves. I think it was a very, as far as like sex work being legalized, I have a big problem with sex work because nobody who does sex work actually wants to, or at least the overwhelming majority of them don't want to. Most people who do sex work are individuals who feel like they are in an economic position where they have to, and since men will pay for it, that is, you could say to an extent, it is both a privilege and a disprivilege of a woman, right? So it's a privilege of a woman to be able to sell their body in that capacity and actually make a profit where a man generally couldn't. But then it's a disprivilege that when women are in a space where feminine jobs are generally valued less than male jobs, right? Or masculine jobs rather, and feminine jobs are valued less than masculine jobs, so they feel like they have to do things like this just to stay afloat in society. That's why I'm for universal basic income. That's why I'm for some kind of a equalizer or a bottom floor of poverty. I don't think that feminine jobs need to be paid as well as masculine jobs. I just think that they should be able to be paid a comfortable amount. I will say one of my notes was that Crowder is rather antagonistic. It can be funny in some cases. In other cases, I think he gets in the way of his conversation, but we're all flawed. There was one point where they brought up that people aren't better than each other. I think that's an entitled privilege, or rather an entitled perspective. People are individually inherently better than other people. There are people who are better for society and people who are worse for society. Obviously you shouldn't generalize and say all like that white people are better than black people, but there are people who are better than people. It was just a weird thing that they kind of brought up, and I wanted to point it out. I'll say another thing. about when it comes to the sexualization of men versus women. I think that one of the things modern day feminism has failed at is the proper context of sexualization. I think that when right now, or not even right now, I think it's shifting, but men who have a high body count are considered like champions. They're very poggers, right? Women are considered less than. The problem is it seems like feminism is much more focused on getting women to be valued for having a high body count rather than to get men to be devalued to the same extent. There needs to be more of a proper context. I think that anybody with a low or a high body count is gross because it's obviously a higher chance of STDs, and it probably shows some kind of inadequacy mentally or physically or something. There's some kind of a mental issue there, and I don't mean like actual mental disorder, but like you have some kind of an issue with your self-confidence and self-worth if you feel the need to have sex with a lot of people. Just for context, I'm somebody with a high body count. Maybe I'm bringing this to more of an anecdotal perspective, but yeah, I think everybody's gross if you have a high body count. I think it's kind of gross. Rather, we shouldn't be valuing women more for it. There are harsher beauty standards for women. I think that women are the ones who also perpetuate that as well. It's not just a male thing, it is a societal thing. And I don't like the constant anti-male narrative. Women are very rude to each other if they don't adhere to a particular beauty standard. I don't think men are actually as rude as women. Women are terrible. There is a nice argument that the girl brought up where men are considered bossy when they're hard asses, but women are considered bitches. I think that there's two attributions to this. One of which is like, yeah, women are just seen as like bitchy if they're bossy, because generally you associate women with what we say, empathy and compassion, and when women have to basically act like men in the workforce, you see them as a bitch. But there's also a factor that some women in these workforces tend to overcompensate the fact that they feel that they're going to be looked down upon by being extra bitchy. But again, that's just them trying to exist in this space. There was one point where they talked about smile more, honey, the idea, and Crowder went into a weird tangent, but this was actually very interesting because he talked about, it's basically, the woman brought up the fact that, hey, men will say smile more, honey. And he was like, yes, because men want to see women that are attractive, and they see that smiling in women, that level of that expression of compassion, is more attractive. The thing is that there's no reason in a workplace setting, which is where this happens, for a man to tell a woman to smile more, because based on Crowder's own logic, that's basically saying, hey, smile more, honey. I want you to be more attractive in this workplace setting, even though the point of being in a workplace setting has literally nothing to do with attractiveness. I would say that it is a disadvantage of women for you to say something like that. In fact, I think that that's very inappropriate comment to even say, because at the core of what you're saying to a woman is, hey, be more attractive to me. We're at work. Very weird, right? I think that there was a point in here where a lot of times when Crowder would make a decent point, they would always go from the United States and they would generalize to the world, where women in other countries have it worse off. Nobody's really saying no to that. So what I would say, though, is that if those places are where activism needs to be done more in, maybe you should go do that over there. I brought it up before, but we talked about biological privilege versus societal privilege. I think we're having an issue of contextualizing that properly and fully. For instance, like men are traditionally, or men are overall generally stronger than women, right? Obviously, we should look at them as individuals, but we did have to lower standards for women to be police officers, firefighters, and etc. But still, some of these privileges don't come from necessarily come from society, but they actually come from like biological predispositions, and it's very difficult for us as a society to decide which ones to shift, because things are shifting so quickly. We're getting to the end. There was actually a very interesting point that they brought up about privilege and when do trans women experience female, or rather, when do women become the victims of female disprivilege, I suppose you could say, right? Because that's kind of what we're talking about. When they say male privilege, you're saying female disprivilege. That's an interesting concept. I think that the only way that a trans woman actually gets women or a female privilege, or disprivilege rather, is if they're fully passing. I think outside of that, there's a difference between trans women and women privilege or disprivilege, because you're treated very differently based on the way that somebody may or may not perceive you. Which is a very interesting thing to bring up. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the privilege in what's surrounding. It's very interesting, right? So like in an online liberal space or even in like an offline liberal space, you being a trans woman or black is going to be more beneficial to you in these spaces because there's a very Oh, okay, good. We were talking about okay, great. So we made it to privilege in based on your surroundings, and I basically made the point that there are privileges based on your surroundings. So yeah, in more progressive spaces, it's more of a privilege to be somebody with an identity group that deviates from the norm. So somebody who's not a straight white cisgender male. But in the general space, there are more privileges, I would imagine, for people who do maintain that normal status quo. So it's just an interesting thing to contextualize where you may or may not have a particular privilege. That's basically the only point I was trying to make at the end there. Let me get some
so much, guys, to all my Patreons, and a special shout out to my Papa XL Patreons. Without all you guys, I would just be some fat dude screaming into a microphone. So thank you so much, guys. Mwah, I love you all. I want Papa Gut to pee on my face, but just as a friend. There's nothing weird about that. I want him to pee on my face.